Hi everyone, thanks for still being here on a Saturday evening. We're really excited to be part of In the City, and it's our first time in Russia as well, so that's very exciting for us.
Yeah, so our talk tonight is going to be called Prototyping Cities Through Virtual Play.
So in our studio as UNP, we make projects which seek to redefine the traditional tools of the architect, engaging with pop culture and technology. So just to go through some of our previous projects, we've defined new mapping languages, constructed giant computers, created playable drawings, drawn speculative cities, fabricated handheld architectural toys, amongst others. And we've established a sort of multimedia practice which has extended to primarily focusing on video game technologies in architecture, and that's what we're going to discuss today. 3 years ago, we formed a research laboratory at the Bartlett School of Architecture, which is at University College in London, where we're also academics. So our studio is called Videogame Urbanism, and we use game technologies to engage new audiences and participants into the design of cities. And we're working with students, cultural institutions, and various industry partners. We're focusing primarily on making playable video games, but also disseminating our work through physical models and publications amongst other media as well.
Yeah, so in the last 3 years, our students have probably made about 30 to 40 different video games of varying levels of ambition. So we'd like to start by talking about how we see video games and how we use them in our own practice. So one of the first things is we like to see video games as conceptual spaces. So we use games to link between new technologies and the history of speculative thinking in architecture. So architects have always thought about and designed virtual spaces throughout history. And often these spaces were not typically designed to be built, but they were made to speak about reality in some way, whether that's a fantasy of a society that doesn't exist or interesting architectural forms or so on. And so our proposal is that architects should be making virtual spaces to speculate on the future development of our cities and to reintroduce experimental thinking into our daily forms of architectural practice. So architects have always played with the city and its meaning. For instance, the Italian architect Giambattista Piranesi produced drawings that combine fact and fiction, constructing them as one architectural world, such as in his Anticita Romana project. These etchings were also widely reproduced, so they were printed on printing presses, and so they could be seen as a kind of mass consumption media of the day, and a preeminent medium for communicating space to a great deal of people, just as the video game is today. This is another drawing by Piranesi called the Campo Maggio plan, and it relates to the real city of Rome, but it reinvents it as a blank canvas populated by historical objects and monuments. And this is also an early example of an urban plan designed around a virtual city that combines multiple sources of information. So Piranesi produced architectural surveys and readings from history and combined them together into drawing into one fantastical urban form. In a similar way, Rome is seen as in an Assassin's Creed game, for instance Brotherhood in 2010, is also composed of fragments from history and fragments from different types of recording that are then composited together into a world. And what these do is they give the player the essence of feeling like they're in a city, in this case Rome, but in reality their experience is carefully crafted around the logics of the game. So when we look at the map of Assassin's Creed's Rome, like Piranesi's Campo Maggio, this is actually a blank canvas structured by points of interest. In this case, they're not usually monuments or historical remains, but instead they're activities and missions for the player to perform within the city that let them see it in a certain way. If we move forward into another Assassin's Creed game, this one Unity, which is set in Paris, they spent, I think, 1 year reconstructing the Notre Dame Cathedral, but actually the cathedral itself has two different time periods within its construction. So to make it more interesting for the player to climb, they put the spires on the cathedral, which weren't actually finished at the time that the game is set. So in this sense, they're kind of combining two different moments in history together in order to produce a feeling of the player, feeling in the player that they know the space that they're in. So while historically it's not correct, the kind of feeling that they produce within the urban form of the video game is potentially a more legitimate city. And this is reminiscent of a Renaissance Capriccio painting. So Capriccio was a form of painting that would combine real and imaginary architectures together into one scene. So by blending different time periods together, it was designed to create an intense and surprising spatial composition. Yet if we look at the world of video games nowadays, these kind of weird and wonderful spatial compositions are to be found everywhere. So we can make links between the history of visual representation and the way that we use games nowadays. And when we think of other conceptual architectural projects that might allow us to understand how a video game process might work in this way, we often go back to the 1960s and 70s, when radical groups such as Archigram, Peter Cook from Archigram was one of the big figures in the recent history of the Bartlett, where we work. They really changed the nature of what we could consider architecture to be. So like Piranesi and other thinkers before them, they explored history and technology to suggest projects such as the walking city and plug-in city, where technology would enable people to reconfigure responsive environments. And they also used and focused on the pop cultural aspects of technology, looking at the cultural media of their day, such as comic books, to analyze and express a hopeful future for architecture that was based on a playful celebration of technology. And we think this is important because while some people might say, why would you look at video games? They're toys, they're things that aren't necessarily serious. We can't really think about our visual culture today without understanding that video games are a massive part of it. For instance, a game like Fortnite, which has obviously become a kind of global phenomenon in the last year or so, when you look at it, it's actually very interesting that players play the game as a kind of architect meets commando, where being able to construct buildings in a kind of rapid way is just as important part of the being good at the game as actually being able to shoot people. And it's kind of interesting that if you think of games that have become very notable in recent years, you have Minecraft, which is obviously very much focused on building, and then you have Fortnite, which also includes that kind of level of creativity in a spatial way, even in a sort of relatively standard shooting game, and it adds this other kind of spatial layer on that people find really engaging. So we might consider game worlds to be kind of closed and utopic, and also they're obviously constructed from computational information. So another historical example we might look at that kind of predicted this situation was the Italian radical group Arcazum, who were working in the 1960s and 70s, and they produced this really beautiful project called No Stop City. And at the time, they argued that with the advent of computer technologies and electronics, the future of utopia was going to be quantitative. That is, the future of our city would reside in the world of information and processes. So they were very right in that prediction. And in this case, through this mirrored box, their world was conceived as a vast isotropic grid that extended off in all directions, across which architecture would be assembled by citizens. So in many ways, they were predicting modern cities where every action within that world can now be regulated by coded and relationships. However, their emphasis on a playful citizen and potentially subversive users within this system, in an encoded utopic system that is kind of highly reminiscent of video game worlds. And the mirrored box that we just showed before, they designed these kind of arcade cabinet type outputs as some of their architectural models, which create this infinite space. And ironically, if you look at the kind of arcade games at exactly the same time, they use the same technique called Pepper's Ghost, which is a mirror that has a reflection passed across it. And so perhaps they were more aware than they might make overtly clear of this relationship between games and these culture industries and their own work. So, as I say, inside these boxes, an infinite grid spread where citizens were free to assemble architectural space as they desired. This work energized the forces of information, organization, and logistics, as well as pop culture and kitsch. So you can see the Ritz crackers and the tents and the stoves and the nature and everything together in this one architectural system. And so inspired by such approaches, in our own work, we've explored things like procedural generation systems for creating architecture on an isotropic virtual grid. So in this game called Drawing Hunter, as the player hunts down architectural glitches in the world, they can blink and reassemble the environment around them because it's all regulated and distributed by a piece of code. So as architects, we're not only designing maybe a set of symbolic components that go into the system, but a system that regulates them. And the player can then generate infinite variations of our architecture at once. And so in our teaching studio, we also critically analyze and revisit iconic master plans from the past, such as this game, which is about Walt Disney's vision for Epcot, which is a kind of giant experimental prototypical...
It's like Community of Tomorrow.
Yeah, which was designed in Florida. So by using video game mechanics, we're able to unlock new potentials of these ideas, interrogating their messages in a virtual environment, which wouldn't have been possible at the time. So most of these experimental architects were making drawings, they're making models, they might make things that you could wear, but they didn't ever make a kind of whole holistic system that could be responding to the user inputs constantly. And we also use screenshots of our gameplay, not in a way that you might conventionally imagine to sell your game, to show how good the graphics are, but as a way of making architectural drawings that broach the idea of an environment that's interactive, an environment that takes place over time, and where the user and the architect are kind of working together in one system. And so, in the end, really, with all of our games, we use the virtual to speak about the desire to change the real. This was another student game inspired by Malevich's Architectons as a kind of unit of space. And this student tested how these objects could operate at multiple scales, going from the scale of the piece in an art gallery through to an infinite metropolis that the player uncovers through understanding certain patterns. And then once we've made these worlds, we also like to treat them as kind of urbanisms and analyze them in ways that we might traditionally analyze the real city, to understand how we've designed things around player movements, what kind of architectural systems or journeys someone might uncover through this world, and really explore how a city might be designed around a player's experience and how that might be scaled up to a citizen in a real place. And we also believe that architectural manifestos of the future can be virtual spaces. So this was a concept we made for a game looking at Rem Koolhaas' book, Delirious New York, as a video game with the player moving between the world of Rem's theory, his brain over there on the left, and Madeleine Vriesendorp's drawn worlds in a conceptual zone uncovered through playing. So we believe that games can take us from someone like Rem's ideas of a retroactive manifesto towards interactive manifestos for urbanism, which might become the future of speculative and conceptual architecture.
So we're also using games to challenge the way that architects have traditionally represented their work and ideas. Architects might have a tendency to create static representations, which are more to be observed rather than to be interacted with. And we believe that video games have the ability to mediate between conventional and contemporary media to create new forms of architectural representation. So drawing typologies such as isometric, oblique, cross-section are ubiquitous to the way to architectural design as ways of communicating complex three-dimensional systems on a flat page. And games also have a kind of similar but divergent history of spatial representation. So isometric and oblique techniques in games were historically used when computer technology couldn't really render 3D geometry. So both have histories and this kind of shared challenge of depicting three-dimensional space on a flat plane, whether that's on page as a drawing or on screen as a game. So hand drawings is still typically an intrinsic part of everyday architectural practice, including ours, but we can easily introduce these drawings into a game engine to begin to spatialize them and make them a bit more than that. And while clients are still admiring the qualities of a hand drawing and what it communicates, by integrating these into a game engine, we can encode new information into the drawing space, rather than simply discarding drawing for games. And we've produced a number of what we like to call playable drawings to demonstrate our designs, each of which is structured to kind of be interacted with rather than simply observed. So this video game is constructed of a completely hand-drawn architectural virtual world, and it's a game world produced to combine a number of our different research projects together into one virtual territory equalized through hand drawing. And it utilizes oblique perspective, which is common to architectural representation as well as games, and created in a three-dimensional virtual world structured around kind of flat-based, sprite-based imagery, which is imported as drawing.
I mean, I think one of the interesting things that we found since we started using game technologies, so we built most of our projects on the game engine Unity, is that actually the way that you construct things to be flattened by the digital camera or the virtual camera in order to be played tells you a lot about the way that architectural imagery might be constructed. So in this case, it's almost like if we were making this drawing in Photoshop, it would obviously be composed of a number of different layers. But when we make this as a game in Unity, these layers of flat drawing of sprite that we've scanned in actually become a kind of three-dimensional construction in themselves, even though the actual drawings are flat. The way that they're placed and kind of laid in the game world is in itself a kind of form of architecture as well.
Yeah. And our research is also seeking to connect game spaces back to kind of other earlier forms of architectural representation in terms of technique and also meaning. So this is a game called Projectives, which was commissioned by the Royal Institute of British Architects. And it's inspired by a series of drawn studies by a Dutch Renaissance architect called Hans Friedman de Vries, who explored perspectival drawing techniques for architecture. So it's really interesting and exciting for us to be commissioned by, the Royal Institute of British Architects, as opposed to making something for the game industry, because it already kind of allows us to begin bridging between the two professions. So this game was designed for 4 players, and they're working together to recompose the drawing on the previous slide as an idealized perspective scene. And each player is navigating through the world in 4 different perspectives, so through plan, isometric, first person, and elevation. And they're attempting to combine their 4 viewpoints together so they converge into one space. The urban game world is actually designed as 4 separate districts, and each of them is designed around that specific viewpoint of each player and the visual parameters in which they see. And however, this is only made clear to all the participants once the game has been completed and the cameras kind of zoom out into this aerial viewport and reveal the world that they've been attempting to navigate within. This perspective view of the original drawing defines a new form of urban plan in one part of the city. So the elevations of the tower blocks in another part, and a series of fragmented pieces in a gallery in another district.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting relationship because, for instance, the writer Robin Evans, writing about perspective, says that perspective is extremely good at representing anything that's made by people, anything that's geometric, and not so great at representing anything natural. So the kind of the relationship between how we draw and communicate architecture, which is obviously becoming more important as we move into technologies like BIM, where we might not necessarily ever have to go through that process of producing the drawing in the same way again. The question of what kind of agency the architectural drawing has, and even the viewpoint of that drawing, I think, is a question that was definitely uppermost in our minds when we start to make projects like this, where we collapse these 4 different things together. Yeah,
and it was also great to see kind of people of all ages and people who weren't used to seeing architectural drawings begin to understand, like, oh, that's where I am in the world, which is a big part of our work as well. And the game essentially allows us to explore the relationship between architectural spaces as a visual composition, and relying on this kind of communication between the players and the spatial negotiation to compose this final space made up of 4 different experiences. So really using a game to question the history of drawing protocols as human-made constructions that are really affecting the way we conceive space before it's built. We're also using games to engage new participants in the design of our cities. So consultation processes which occur in our cities today during procurement processes, they can often appear kind of closed door or limit who's involved. And we think that by introducing video games into this process, we can encourage participation and generate user feedback through play. Games can be used for live engagement with people and combine a lot of different voices together from all kinds of different places. So in this game, City Skylines, we can see the happiness of citizens change as the player is making decisions. And it's almost a kind of, well, it is an overlay of data which is responding to the player's actions. And such games can provide instant feedback as virtual spaces that can be interacted with by others. So what we really find interesting is that video games are allowing us to plug in real-time information which we can critique, reframe, and also hack existing design protocols in the city and actually allow the player to have an effect on their surroundings.
Yeah, but I think in this case it's also really important to remember that this game, like SimCity that came before it, has a kind of, although this game isn't made by Americans, it kind of almost portrays a kind of very American-led vision of urbanism, which doesn't necessarily work for every culture, for every city, for every site that it might be applied to. So one of the things that hopefully we'll talk about with some of the projects coming up is how we might make games that are much more specific in the way that they tackle things, and how we might be much more aware of some of the messages that come through here, and the embedded politics that's always slightly under the surface in games.
And obviously, games such as Minecraft have had a really large impact on virtual world building, so much so that authorities have created physical versions of these in their consultation processes, as seen here through the project Blockholm in Sweden. And we feel this connection between virtual and physical worlds are really important to begin to establish new forms of dialogue through design. And in our studio, we've been making games to interrogate existing processes which shape our cities. So this video game was a response to the planning process in the UK. So the planning notice is a A4 piece of paper which is pinned onto a lamppost, and it basically tells the public what's going to happen on that site, a planned development. And so through the game, which seeks to expose the kind of tolerances that exist within the planning system and the lack of information that's given to the public, players are actually invited into this process to design their own alternative proposals that could still gain planning permission within the kind of text that's given to the public on that notice.
Yeah, so the game starts with something quite dull, like changing the ground floor of a building from one type of shop to a coffee shop, and ends up sometimes in quite surreal places, but in each case they're basically picking up on the latitude that exists in the UK's planning, the way that planning decisions are communicated, and allowing the player to experiment with that.
So while the game space acts as a testing ground for players, the planning notice becomes a kind of portal into the virtual world, making these designs more accessible to members of the public. And these could be accessed through AR technologies, linking the physical site to the virtual world. We're also proposing new forms of participation through play in analog game forms and not just digital. So although we make a lot of video games, this is, we feel, a really important part of our practice, as it actually introduces users to gaming principles for people who might not be so familiar or used to playing video games. So our project Peep Pop City, which was shown at Now Play This at Somerset House in London, it was an experimental games festival, is an example of this, and we drew influence from Archizoom's No Stop City model, which we mentioned previously in the mirrored box. We asked 2 players to work together at one time to build a city by reacting to a series of cards which have objectives on them, and these are inspired by real situations that have helped shape London. So, for example, you might be asked to place green belts or react to new skyscrapers or provide new homes. And by placing various game blocks within a mirrored box, the cause of the player's actions are repeated off into infinity and shows the city as a continuous loop. And we think games are a really inclusive medium which can extend the conversation to all ages and across all practices, and something that a traditional architectural drawing might not be able to do. So by allowing players to touch and actually affect the city, new propositions can be made as a result of play and be fed back into the design process earlier on. And another project, which is an example of this, so inviting users in to affect their environment through play on a more architectural scale, is called the Planning Portal. So this project imagines democratic decisions about UK cities being made by a game played in a mobile pavilion. And as cities are placing balls into different tubes, the building starts to become a record of public consensus. And this would be displayed visually across the facade, and it might change day by day or depending on the location to collect data from all across the country and visualize that. And we're also looking at how such participatory systems will work through integrating data and game environments. So this is a concept for a project in development called Infotropolis, which combines real data systems with a video game application to allow Londoners to prototype new futures for their city. And players will be able to manipulate architectural structures in real time and be able to see the results of their decisions. And so we see this as a tool which can be used by developers or authorities to include citizens in the processes at an earlier stage in a really engaging medium. And games can be an integral part of new chains of information that can allow the public to begin to understand the complex data systems that are underpinning our cities. So making an engaging game that makes data easier to understand and act upon will actually allow architects to engage more people into the design processes and begin to challenge the top-down urbanism.
So I guess in order to build the approaches that we've developed, we analyse game worlds to understand how they represent urbanism, what people experience when they play such games, and how we can take those lessons into our own design practice. So game worlds tend to be structured very differently to real cities, even when they're trying to portray the quality of a real city. And in order to understand how game worlds can create a sense of the urban, we can ask questions about the limit of virtual experience and what messages about cities we receive while experiencing architecture through games. Grand Theft Auto 5 by Rockstar Games is structured around Los Santos, which is an incredibly realistic depiction of Los Angeles that's the backdrop to what is the best-selling game of all time. I mean, I think one thing we find really interesting is that of all the fantasy worlds that players could experience in games, the one that seems to be the most popular is going to Los Angeles in this virtual realm. And what does that also tell us about the agency of these virtual worlds? And so through our research, such as mapping techniques, overlaying different scales of drawings together to understand the morphology of this world, we can see that although Los Santos resembles Los Angeles, so Los Santos is the one surrounded by water, and Los Angeles is the one behind it, geographically it's very different. And the designers of the game are acutely aware that the urban experience of Los Angeles, for instance, can be recreated through a compressed and distorted version of the real city. In fact, you probably want it to be a recreation, you want it to be compressed and distorted because if you've visited Los Angeles, you know that traffic can be very tedious, which is not necessarily what you want to recreate in this world. So it's an urban morphology using systems to express the qualities of Los Angeles rather than a direct one-to-one geographic translation. So by producing analytical maps, we can unpick the logic of Los Santos. For instance, by looking at the physics of the game, whereby cars can kind of travel much more freely and go up much higher slopes than they can do in real life, we made maps that show that the true mobility of this city doesn't actually come from the representation of roads in the game, but it comes from all the other spaces in that game world that are accessible in your vehicle. And so this comes just from tweaking the physics of the game, but completely changes the messages that the city gives to the player. And also looking at transit systems and public services in Los Santos, we can see a virtual city that seemingly has European levels of public infrastructure spending given to it. So Rockstar Games being mainly based in Scotland, the amount of transport infrastructure, hospitals and police stations, but maybe particularly transport infrastructure, really flies in the face of Los Angeles, which has a kind of notoriously underfunded and hard to understand bus route system. So actually the game maybe in the opposite direction to something like SimCity and City Skylines is giving us potentially a Eurocentric view of this American city. So by making further maps of the space, we can understand the way players move around the city and how it's structured both through the movement of the character but through movements that are directed by the game structure itself in terms of markers and objectives we're supposed to follow. But in GTA 5, also the fact that as the game is loading the scenery of the city, it sort of zooms in and out from a kind of Google Earth style satellite view. And in a way that this almost legitimizes it as a virtual city because we get to see the city in a very granular stage at one point, and then we get to see it from above and we get to zoom in and out. Actually, it's masking the loading of the game, but it's very clever the way that they do that. And so this makes us think of things like the British architectural historian Rayner Banham, who wrote a seminal book about Los Angeles called The Four Ecologies. And he said that Los Angeles was a city where mobility outweighs monumentality. And what he meant by that was we shouldn't really apply European-centric models of judging urbanism to Los Angeles, because it doesn't. If you judge it against Rome, it won't be successful. But if you judge Los Angeles under its own logics, it's a very successful city in a particular paradigm. And by playing Grand Theft Auto, we get a similar message of the city. We can jump in and out of cars, we can keep moving all the time. And so in a way, they've made a game that really sums up these arguments that he was making about the city, that really movement is the most important thing about it. And so overlaying the game systems into drawings like this allows us to understand this as a city designed to keep the player moving, from the physics of the cars to the number of police that chase you to the hospitals that get you back on your feet. So this was another game developed in our studio called Homestead, which studied LA through examining its housing. The game was designed around a series of case study houses where the player's interaction with a suburban home causes it to change and evolve under the logics of life in the suburban drift of the city. As the player interacts with individual homes in the left camera, we can see changes from this individual building reflected out onto the suburban master plan. And each house relates to a reimagining of the American suburban home in relation to speculative new ways of living. This was a house dedicated to profit, which the player can turn into an Airbnb property, in quite a simple judgment, or can allow the house to be taken over by oil derricks and advertising hoardings. The former, the access to oil being a particular part of LA's history, where property owners would sell the subterranean drilling rights under their homes to oil companies. And this was another project from our studio which analysed Suburbia as depicted in the Sims games. So this student, Agostino, by making economic analysis of the Sims, revealed that the in-game hobby that your character can take of making garden gnomes was actually the most profitable form of work that Sims could perform in the game. As a hobby in the game, it could make you more money than going to the office and operating in a kind of very typical paradigm for that, of the way that Sims are supposed to act in that game. But actually what the gnome shows us is that it's emblematic of the collapse between work and leisure time that we've seen in the emergence of digital technologies. And so he created 3 different garden gnomes to compare the material economy of the gnomes created in The Sims to reality. So he carved one by hand, he 3D printed one, and one was CNC machined, and he compared that to the Sims productivity level in the game.
I think he lost, actually. I think the game won.
Yeah, but the one that he carved by hand was the nicest looking one, I think. And so in the end, this material economy was developed into a video game urbanism that twists the nature of American suburbia towards collective living and communes predicated around the production of garden gnomes. Here, The Sims and its caricature of suburbia provided a route into a critique of the real logics of mass-produced and commodified architecture. So we also make games which critique London in particular and the changes that are taking place in that city. This project challenges architectural advertisements, or development aesthetics as they've come to be known, which are these adverts that are plastered all over construction sites in London, where developers boast about how much better their buildings are than everyone else, how you get a better view, how you're a better person if you stay here, and all of that kind of thing. And so we made a game called the London Developers Toolkit, which is a satirical game application that imagines a future where developers do away with architects and generate all of the imagery and designs that they need through automated software. So to make this game, we developed a series of typologies and units through analysing London, news reports and research papers alongside some fictional designs. And these are all the components that we put into the game. And so by constructing them in a colourful voxel modelling style, using a voxel modelling program, it gives them this kind of appearance which is obviously like Minecraft, which again we found really interesting because the messages that we're trying to send through the game are quite important and serious ones that face London, but through using this sort of childlike way of kind of showing them visually, we emphasize the game-like nature. We also allow multiple, we allow kids to engage with it as well as parents, and we also layer in a kind of another critique of how the game might hide really complex and serious messages within something that's seemingly played for leisure. So as the player plays the game, they have to complete various activities that the architect will no longer need to do, such as tracing napkin sketches. So the famous architect who does this wonderful design on a napkin in a restaurant over a bottle of champagne. And then they need to define different parameters for their building. And then they need to kind of negotiate with the councillors in different parts of London to allow this building to be built. But really, the game is actually just running on a random system. So it doesn't really matter what you do, it's going to create a random building for you, and you don't really have any control over that. But at that point, you get access to a kind of mediocre version of Photoshop, where you can create your own architectural advertisements. So you can choose different backgrounds, you can introduce different people who are there to help sell your architecture, and you can, in the end, basically print and cut out and keep different drawings that you've made from this game. So while the game's not intended as a design tool, it's actually intended to operate as a platform for the public to produce physical artifacts from a game world while drawing attention to issues that are affecting London.
So we also look at how game spaces offer both old and new forms of spatial wayfinding, from their architecture to symbolic elements which are placed within the worlds. We want to question how we can extract the logics of wayfinding in game worlds and apply them into the real city. So what is it that makes us so curious to explore these expansive virtual worlds and navigate within them, and what lessons might we draw out from those to apply them to the real world? Many game worlds will possess spatial layouts that can direct the player in certain ways, and beyond this there are countless symbols and markers that are also used to guide movement. Within the aesthetic of games, the objective marker and layers of graphic information are generally an intrinsic part of the way we experience the spaces. So this can run from games such as XCOM, where the built environment is literally divided into units of information, through to Uncharted, where the player learns they can climb through specific details in the architecture. Our project titled Architecture After Games explored the implication of taking these game logics and associated details into the physical environment of the medieval and Renaissance galleries at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So game elements were positioned next to relevant historical artifacts from within the museum. So we paired them up depending on their kind of alternative, as fragments from alternative virtual histories which could be uncovered by visitors through the galleries. Our design made comparisons between historical artifacts and wayfinding in games as a way of extending the physical space of the gallery through the principles of the virtual worlds. So we compared the game Portal and its mechanic of connecting spaces to a doorway from Genoa in the gallery, becoming the only marker of status for the building that sits behind it. So we see that also acting as a portal itself to another building. The portal of the doorway was accompanied by a door inspired by the game Prey, used by the player to move quickly around the map, which is sited in front of an altar which was brought from Florence in the gallery. And so by collapsing movements through space, game worlds operate similar to the V&A galleries, where built fragments from different places and different time periods can be reassembled around the viewer to explore. And we developed designs from further spatial tropes, such as skyboxes, distant buildings and environments on the fringes of game worlds that can suggest larger expanses that maybe aren't usually visited in games. And in this way, the gallery is extended through a floor-mounted mural, suggesting the depths of a world beneath. But just like in the game environment, the visitors can look upon these spaces, but maybe not be able to access them or explore them.
Yeah, I think, like, for instance, in this case, we're really interested in things like Lev Manovich writing about the history of murals and frescoes in architecture and how they were kind of early form of virtual space, where the space of the image and the space of the architecture were the kind of same space. And so this is our kind of version of that process as well in relation to games.
Yeah. And this particular drawing is inspired by the game BioShock, where we suggest this subterranean world that could be existing beneath the galleries underneath the floor. And the project was conceived as a route within the galleries of the museum, so players or visitors finding each of these fragments and attempting to understand the virtual spaces which are implied by each element as they uncover them. And so extending the galleries in ways common to video game worlds. And we've also explored how these types of game aesthetics might start to inform new architectural languages that play on people's familiarity with games and the visual language that comes with those. So here we propose new forms of wayfinding that appear as giant markers in the landscape. And so you can see these partially disappearing through the ground in a portal, and then the other one would reappear in another location on the other side of the park for viewers to kind of connect and explore. And having studied typical gate typologies for these Swedish communal parks, we played with how we might subject them to the type of distortions which are common in video game wayfinding. And so spatial possibilities explored in games might also suggest new languages and compositional strategies for architecture and wayfinding in the real world.
So ultimately, we're testing how games can be used in new forms of architectural practice and how games might become a key tool for architects and urbanists. So I think, as we said, we're interested in games as tools of engagement, but I think we're also interested in kind of refiring that spirit from previous generations of architects, where the idea of being experimental and how these kind of conceptual architectures could speak about reality is also really important. Because obviously games enable us to build, for instance, gravity-free worlds. They enable us to build worlds that really challenge some of the fundamental principles of architecture. And perhaps if we see that not as a deficit, but we see that as a potential for speculation, then we can start to make some really interesting work in the future. Of course, architects are now nearly always producing 3D modeled information, whether that's for drawing packages, renderings, BIM models, or structural analysis and things like that. So it's not necessarily a large step to imagine how this information could instead be directed towards interactive 3D game worlds that allow for new forms of inquiry. The way that you need to construct the 3D model, for instance, might be a little bit different, but the connections are quite close and quite easy to make. But I guess we should also say that there's a whole burgeoning industry of architectural visualization, for instance, which is more about how to represent a building. So VR is becoming a big kind of facet of that. How can we represent a building in the state in a very realistic way of what that building is going to look like in the future? But I think we're more interested in pushing the mechanics of the game itself beyond necessarily a realistic architectural representation in that way, and to kind of question the limits of architecture through this technology. And so we've investigated how games might structure architectural and urban approaches in a project called Tokyo Backup City, which was a research project we've worked on for a few years on and off, which is a speculative master plan located in Osaka in Japan. And it's inspired by a real plan by a Japanese politician and a committee called NEMIC, which was to build another seat of government in the case of Tokyo's destruction in a natural disaster. So they proposed to build another kind of mini-city on the site of an airport in Osaka, which is kind of controversial because Tokyo and Osaka have a sort of bit of a rivalry going on. And this master plan was created following the 2011 tsunami. What was interesting was that as a privately funded initiative, it was controversial in proposing the introduction of American-style gambling resorts, which are currently illegal in Japan. The project was conceived purely as a business park, meaning that while governmental facilities might be retained in an emergency, its morphology did not relate to Tokyo in any way. And so what we're really interested in one of the principles of this project was the idea of backing up. How do we preserve something? Perhaps just to preserve something, as maybe the makers of Grand Theft Auto showed us, to preserve Los Angeles, you don't necessarily need to make a kind of exact geographic replication of Los Angeles, but you could make a game world that feels very much like being there, and that for many people would be the right approach. So we were interested in applying similar principles here, that perhaps this shouldn't be a kind of Anodyne business park, but actually we could create another alternative. And at the same time, while examining these plans, we'd also begun research into a unique type of Japanese arcade game called Middlegames, which are like a supersized pachinko machine, if you know a pachinko machine with the tiny little balls going through. And these also operate as gambling lotteries that you can find in any Japanese arcade. And both pachinko and these medal games, they allow gambling to take place through transactions where players buy cash, they then get turned into tokens, they can then gamble with those, they then sort of hopefully put it back into cash or back into some prize. And it's this kind of weird legal loophole that Japan has about gambling. But ironically, despite operating with that loophole, the pachinko industry and the Japanese gambling industry is larger than Las Vegas and Singapore combined, I think. So these machines become an embodiment of a very particular sort of part of Japanese culture, where the exchange of one piece of information for another piece of information allows you to kind of do things in a slightly different way. So while the original Backup City proposal used American gambling resorts to fund the idea, we speculated that Japan's current gambling mechanisms could be applied instead. And so by using the medal game as a model for urban centers, we instead proposed gamifying the entire urban realm of this backup city as an elaborate lottery which would work within Japan's existing legal constraints. So we did a lot of analysis trying to understand these machines, the structure of the games and the mechanisms that they use in order to create basically patterns within an overall randomized algorithm. And these machines, so this machine here is probably 2.5 meters tall, and this is quite a small one, some of them are huge. But they're carefully designed to engage players and involve them in the process, while the physical nature of their mechanisms are designed to be seen as more trustworthy than a computer screen alone. And this also raises interesting questions about digital technologies and how people trust in them or don't trust in them. And in the case of this industry, making a physical machine is seen as more trustworthy than using a screen. And people can relate to it more. So there's still that kind of physical element to the games, which is really important. And so by understanding the technologies of these machines, we then think about how we can maybe apply their mechanisms and their principles at a larger scale. So we imagined potentially using smart city systems and information to feed into a giant lottery that would be performed at an urban scale to generate capital for the project and kind of operate as a new urban design methodology. So we used the kind of structural analysis of these machines as the starting point for that. And then to get to the idea of how a city might be backed up and preserved, rather than the generic business park of the original plan, we designed new medals by new ideas of medal games by extracting elements of Tokyo's DNA. So how we typically do this is through site visits to cities. So we went to Tokyo a number of times with students as well. We do typological sampling, and we have knowledge exchange with local institutions and universities in order to understand the culture in which we're working.
Play a lot of games, of course. That's important.
So the politics, economy, culture and leisure, nature and geography of Tokyo were used to design a series of medal structures that would challenge the generic zoning of the previous scheme and create a new idea of a master plan. So alongside analysis and modelling, we continue to use drawing as a way of unravelling speculative ideas. And through drawing, we produce new forms of information, remodelings of typologies. We also use photographic recordings, memories from games and sketches, which then become combined together into an architectural language that embraces the collisions of traditional aesthetics with the modern-day medal game cabinet. I guess to return to the point, if you were to take the city Skylines model and try to create Tokyo with it, you could maybe create certain districts of Tokyo, but not all of them, because there are some which have grown in a far different manner. So, as a result, our urban plan for Tokyo Backup City draws from the unique legal and cultural position of the medal game, encoding different zones of Tokyo into different centres, which use the mechanism of the medal game to establish their urban logic as a game system played by the whole city itself. Different medals relate to different aspects of Tokyo's urban morphology, connecting together into one condensed mini-city. So the original idea of the city was, I think, that there would be 100,000 people working here, but only 20,000 people would live here at any one time, so it would become very much a commuter city. So we imagined that kind of interchange of people could be used to drive this game. So these are some drawings we made of the city, where we see it from above in an aerial view as an intense urban composition. So this type of drawing explores the intensity and friction of a city reduced down into the size of an airport rather than the bland buildings of the original proposal. So what happens if you take a massive city and make it tiny rather than an airport and put some buildings on it? And by exploding one of the medals, we can see the different spatial programs contained within. In this case, this was an urban centre which was related to the 4 legal gambling sports of Japan, which have 4 other exceptions, which is horse racing, powerboat racing, motorbike speedway, and Kirin cycling. And these sports will be turned into games within a game within this gigantic tower. And then the color burn of Tokyo's neon surfaces is encoded into drawings to suggest a new city that retains intensity and friction rather than preconceived zones. So in the same way that the medal game overwhelms the player to distract them, this drawing overloads the viewer to emphasize a spatial alternative to the anodyne, clearly divided zones of commerce defining the original proposal. And to explore how someone might understand the city from within, we encode 4 different versions of the proposal into one virtual game space. So what's really interesting about being able to use a game engine, for instance, is that we can obviously embed interactivity, different versions of the world into the game that the player can uncover through playing it and through interacting with it. So the player can see how the city might develop in different directions depending on economic and social trends. So we might produce a super condensed version of Ginza, business district, a touristic version of the Kabukicho red light district, or a hub of Harajuku aesthetics. So in our game version of the city, the player can explore these districts from multiple viewpoints at once, exposing modulations in the urban composition as they move through the world. Through the player's interaction, they effectively recomposite the environment, switching elements on and off around them depending on the actions they take and the areas of the city that they walk through. So this allows us to quickly prototype the various possible futures that this city might have as an urban design, and how different influences might cause this backup city to develop in different ways in the future. So, although this project is speculative, we haven't been asked to, actually build it yet, and the real project is probably more likely to happen. It responds directly to a real existing plan with very strong legal ramifications for Japanese society. So, in doing a project like this, we believe games can become a key part of architectural design and urban practices to come. They allow us to examine cities, create virtual architectures, and invite new audiences to participate in design, working together to prototype new futures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. It was amazing.
Thank you.
We have, I guess, 15 minutes for Q&A session. У нас есть несколько минут на ваши вопросы. Задавайте. Вот молодой человек.
По-русски, да?
Сейчас, секунду.
Добрый вечер. Совсем недавно у нас был такой случай, когда стало известно, что администрация одного села в Ленинградской области проектирует общественные пространства в игре The Sims 2. И общество это восприняло кто-то с юмором, кто-то с негодованием, но у меня к вам вопрос. Можно ли считать, что на самом деле за таким подходом к градостроительству будущее?
I guess that the tool has to be fit. The tool has to be fit for purpose in that respect. That it's very interesting that games can be used as a way of directly allowing people to engage with architecture, but we need to ensure that whatever game we might make can provide a system that can give the right type of feedback for the design process. So perhaps The Sims is not the right thing you would use to design a piece of architecture in that way, because it relies on very specific tropes. Again, it relies on specific tropes of maybe American suburbia that might not necessarily find their way to be easily translated into other contexts. So I think what we're really interested by is by making games as kind of discrete and focused situations where we might be able to solve specific problems through the design.
I think it's always difficult creating a tool for someone for whatever they're doing, whether it's designing a city or making something or whatever. And that's always a struggle we face or I'm sure any game designer faces when they're designing this framework for someone to play in, because obviously you're ultimately providing a certain number of tools and limiting actions. But I think the more we experiment with these things and the more we create and the more contextual they can be in the way we create them, I think the more potential they end up having, which is really exciting.
Yeah. Actually, there was an article recently, I think in Metropolis magazine, where it was focusing on people who remade famous architecture in The Sims, and someone was making Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water in The Sims. And again, it kind of reinforces that maybe the sense of proportion in that tool was not correct, because it's a good effort to build it. It's a fun thing to do, but it lacked the kind of architectural quality of the original building, because simply that game was not designed as a tool to kind of engage with Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. But there's no reason why someone couldn't build a game that would allow you to do that in a different way.
Да, еще вопросы? Вот молодой человек.
Спасибо. Я впервые вижу такое количество игр с необычным геймплеем и прекрасным дизайном. И я хотел бы задать два вопроса. Во-первых, есть ли аудитория у таких игр, то есть люди, которые с удовольствием играют в игры, посвященные архитектуре, не пугаются тому, что в них представлены новые игровые элементы, геймплей абсолютно незнакомый? Это первый вопрос. Являются ли эти игры коммерчески успешными? Второй вопрос. И третий вопрос. Что является источником вдохновения для создания геймплея в этих играх? А также какая их главная цель создания прототипов в экспериментальных жанрах? Что решают эти игры? Большое спасибо.
So I think regarding the audience, at the moment we generally operate in an academic context. So, for instance, the RA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, that was more of a kind of professional context with architects. So I would say that the main audience that we've engaged with are either academic or practicing architects rather than game designers per se. Although we've had some collaborations with some game design courses as well. On the second point, all of these games are at the moment created in university environments, so we haven't really turned them into anything commercial. I think that turning something into a commercial project as well, I guess, places different different restrictions and possibilities in what we can achieve, in that we can make things that break. No one's paid for it. It doesn't matter that it breaks all the time, and we can experiment. Whereas if we start getting into that world, there's different questions. But I think it's something that's very interesting to us. And I guess lastly, on the mechanics, we try to draw from the whole world of games, but then I think in relation to, say, architectural history, some of the projects that we showed came from a study where every student was given a very famous conceptual architectural project from the past and asked to think what mechanic might relate to the world that these people set up. What kind of way of existence might be appropriate for that world, and how can you design that as a mechanic? Drawing from existing game tropes or existing cliches of games, but then twisting it slightly towards those type of projects.
Yeah, I think in terms of other references and things, as we said at the start, being so interested in kind of exploratory with lots of different media types, whether it's comic book, and throughout history, contemporary and historical, whether it's comic books, video games that we played when we were younger that maybe have been remade and re-released, which is really exciting as well, to paintings, to old etchings. I think all of that stuff ends up feeding its way in somehow, and hopefully to make each game kind of unique to its context as well and to its user. So yeah, if it's for someone younger, perhaps it needs to be a bit more low poly and colourful to attract them. And I think by playing games, we've kind of also responding to what entices us into those spaces and for other people as well.
Спасибо. Вот, да, молодой человек.
Здравствуйте, Чертович Данил. Вот. Мой вопрос будет о разнице понимания пространства вообще как такового вот, в видеоиграх и насколько оно вообще влияет на наше восприятие мира как такового. Вот. Недавно прочитал одну статью, где рассказывалось о том, что одно австралийское племя, оно в принципе не использует такое понятие, как там лево, право, прямо, там, назад, оно все время они так общаются, да, то есть я пошел куда-нибудь там на юго-восток сегодня или там потом свернул немножко пошел на север, и в общем у них из-за этого восприятия они понимают пространство как компас, как ориентацию относительно сторон света, но они абсолютно не привыкли понимать мир так, как его понимаем мы. Вот. В частности, люди раньше воспринимали Землю двухмерной, сейчас мы ее понимаем как трехмерный объект. Вот. Насколько вообще есть вероятность того, что в будущем наше восприятие, если оно поменяется, например, там, теория Стивена Хокинга, его понимание времени как четвертой величины, как пространства не трехмерного, а времени как одного из элементов пространства, насколько, если мы поймем вот эту логику и заложим ее, например, в видеоигры и так далее, да, насколько это поможет менять восприятие человечества, насколько это вообще реально? Спасибо.
Wow. I guess to approach it lightly, the exciting thing about games, I guess, is you can control movement and you can make it harder or easier, more abstract to move and navigate around the space. And I don't know, I guess that does, thinking about it as an architect who, I'm also working on real buildings, that's also a manipulation of space, and if you want someone to move slower through a building and to take more time, you build that in, you design that in as well. So in a way, I see a parallel already, whether it's subconscious or just because I'm kind of unique, maybe building buildings and designing games. But yeah, I definitely see a relationship to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, games tend towards conditions of intensity. The player has more abilities and more physical capabilities than they do in real life, although there's interesting people like the artist game studio called Tale of Tales, who did a game where you have to walk an elderly woman through a graveyard and sit on a bench, and the pace of it is so slow that it's supposed to make you kind of re-regard what it's like to experience that kind of space. So there's games that kind of work against those kind of existing models where everyone's heroic in games and everyone has these amazing physical capabilities. But then I think there's also been studies performed where, for instance, they took people, I think in Australia, who played Grand Theft Auto 3 and asked them, basically found that there was quite a lot of resonances because Melbourne was also built on a grid system between the New York that they saw in the game and no, it's New York in that one, and Melbourne, and that they found these kind of weird connections within like supermarkets, because somehow a supermarket's like a very bright graphic space that's very clearly sort of human made, and to them that kind of graphic point proved like a kind of connecting point between the virtual and the real, so they felt themselves walking like they were the character in Grand Theft Auto. So, they're just going to the shops to buy some groceries while they're playing the game, but somehow they found themselves like kind of role-playing and acting like they were in the game, because somehow this particular space is so closely connected to the aesthetics of games. So I think there's going to be more and more of those linkage points, I guess, especially as the game technologies improve and things can become more and more realistic. Obviously, the kind of well-known scary trope is the drone pilot who can't necessarily tell that much of a difference between the drone that he's flying and the video game that he's playing, and how those kind of aesthetics are so close that they start to ask really interesting questions. I'm not sure that's quite as exactly what you were asking, but...
У нас есть время еще на пару вопросов. Если они есть. Вот, вижу, молодой человек.
Добрый вечер, спасибо за очень интересную лекцию, но у меня остался один вопрос. У архитекторов, у проектировщиков есть куча инструментов визуального проектирования, которые в том числе предоставляют возможность изучить, условно, глазами пользователя проектируемого пространства это пространство. Почему именно видеоигры? Что они вам дают? Или это только для того, чтобы можно было с помощью скриптов переключиться между режимом Кавай Токио и альтернативными Токио? Я думаю, что не только. То есть используете ли вы какое-то программирование для моделирования поведения пользователя, для задания каких-то рамок для этого пользователя. Спасибо.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that we're working on with students in particular and developing is, so I guess the quick answer to your question maybe is that through game structures themselves, we're able to model behaviors, model situations that aren't necessarily visible. You know, architecture, most of the, or a lot of the kind of techniques we would use are going to be visual and they're going to be about describing a space. But through a game we can start to address issues that might affect architecture in different ways, whether someone has access to a space, whether someone, you know, has some kind of limitations that prevent them from experiencing a space. What we allow someone to do in terms of their agency in a space is something that architects have talked about for, you know, many years. You know, the idea of a house places being like a machine for living in, or the kitchen being analysed in certain ways as to how people behave in that. So I think in that respect, there are, yeah, that's where I see the power of the game is that we can encode different rules and possibilities into the architecture that we make.
Yeah, I think it's also important to recognise that video games are everywhere as well, and so many people play them. You know, lots of different media types throughout history have had such an impact on architecture, you know, some of which we already showed, you know, whether it's comics or drawings or film, and we really feel that like video games can affect that as well now, just because they do have such an amazing reach and they are being adopted by so many people as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to give an example that we didn't show today, but another game that we worked on with students was about your carbon footprint. So they took the model of a role-playing game, you know, where you have a series of statistics about your character, and they applied it to carbon footprint. So what do you do as a person that has an impact on the world in terms of the carbon that you use? So depending on how the player plays in the game, your footprint goes up or down. And they then kind of saw that potentially if we can track that and expose that to people, that we can enable them to, or we can make them understand how they might live in a more ecological way.
Yeah, because that's something that you would never see unless you maybe are interested and go on an online calculator and look it up and then forget that number. But by actually compressing space and time and demonstrating how small actions can have a really big effect of your daily life, your weekly life, your lifetime, yeah, that's something really exciting to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more extreme end that they went to with that idea is that perhaps in the future we might need to make a society and a city structure that if you don't live in an ecological fashion, maybe you're not allowed into a public park because, you know, you're not giving back to society in the same way. So I don't know, you can extend it into these kind of really interesting potential urban structures that might relate to a more keen understanding of this ecology.
Есть еще один вопрос. Да, давайте.
Я хочу уточнить, то есть одно из применений вот этих ваших технологий, оно в том, чтобы не в том, чтобы архитекторы сами этим пользовались, а в том, чтобы дать людям возможность изучать пространство с помощью игр.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you guys. It was a wonderful lecture.